December 1944, the Ardennes forest, Belgium. A cold wind moved through the dark pine trees, carrying the smell of wet earth and smoke. Snow had begun to fall during the night, settling quietly on abandoned trenches and shattered branches. In the early morning darkness, columns of German infantry moved cautiously along a narrow forest road. Boots crunched softly in frozen mud. Engines from armored vehicles rumbled somewhere behind them. For a moment, the forest felt almost silent. Then the sky cracked open. The first American artillery shells slammed into the trees ahead with a violent flash. The ground shook as explosions tore through the forest, splintering trunks and throwing snow and soil into the air. German soldiers dropped to the ground, covering their helmets as fragments whistled through the cold air. Another shell followed, then another. Within seconds, the forest was engulfed in thunder. Hundreds of artillery guns from the United States Army had begun firing in coordinated waves. Shells landed with terrifying precision, one after another, as if an endless storm of steel had descended from the clouds. Minutes passed, then half an hour. Still the bombardment did not stop. For many German soldiers, the most frightening realization slowly emerged through the chaos. These American guns did not seem to run out of ammunition, and the reason for that relentless firepower began long before the first shell ever landed in the Ardennes. Long before the winter fighting in the Ardennes, military planners across Europe already understood one brutal truth about modern warfare. Artillery decided battles. During the Second World War, more soldiers were killed or wounded by artillery shells than by rifles, machine guns, or even tanks. Explosive fragments from high-velocity shells could strike across wide areas, destroying positions that infantry alone could never reach. A well-placed artillery barrage could collapse an attack before it even began. For both sides of the war, artillery became the backbone of battlefield power. The German armed forces, known as the Wehrmacht, had relied heavily on artillery doctrine since the early days of the war. German commanders believed in concentrated firepower, carefully timed barrages, and close coordination between artillery batteries and advancing infantry. During the invasions of Poland in 1939 and France in 1940, German artillery had played a crucial role in breaking defensive lines and supporting fast-moving armored divisions. Yet Germany's early victories also depended on something else: speed. The famous Blitzkrieg operations combined tanks, aircraft, and artillery in rapid assaults designed to overwhelm enemies before they could respond. In these early campaigns, artillery supported the advance, but it was rarely the central force driving the battle. The United States Army approached the problem differently. American military planners studied the brutal lessons of the First World War, where artillery barrages had devastated entire armies across the trenches of Europe. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, U.S. doctrine increasingly emphasized the idea that artillery should be not just supportive, but dominant. If properly organized, American artillery could become a flexible weapon capable of striking targets anywhere on the battlefield within minutes. The system relied on several key innovations. First were trained forward observers. These officers and enlisted specialists moved alongside infantry units at the front lines. Equipped with portable radios and field maps, they could observe enemy positions and call for artillery fire almost instantly. Within moments, coordinates could be transmitted back to artillery batteries positioned miles behind the front. Second was centralized fire control. Unlike many armies that kept artillery units tied closely to individual divisions, American doctrine allowed multiple artillery battalions to combine their firepower when needed. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of guns could be coordinated against a single target. The result was a devastating concentration of explosive force. But doctrine alone could not sustain continuous artillery fire. For that, an army needed ammunition, an extraordinary amount of it. Each standard shell fired by AM-2 A1 105 mm howitzer weighed more than 30 pounds. Larger weapons, such as the M1 155 mm howitzer, fired shells weighing nearly 100 pounds. In a single intense barrage, one artillery battalion could fire thousands of these shells in just a few hours. To maintain that pace of fire required a supply system operating on a massive scale. By 1943 and 1944, the United States had become the most powerful industrial nation involved in the war. Factories across the country were producing weapons, vehicles, aircraft, and ammunition in staggering quantities. Entire cities were transformed into production centers where workers assembled artillery shells day and night. Millions of shells were manufactured every month. Trains carried them across the continent to Atlantic ports. Cargo ships transported them across submarine-infested waters toward Britain and the European continent. From there, trucks and rail systems distributed ammunition to depots near the front lines. Behind every artillery gun firing in Europe stood a vast industrial network stretching thousands of miles across the ocean. German intelligence officers knew the United States possessed enormous production capabilities. But on the battlefield, the full scale of that power often came as a shock. When American artillery units opened fire, the bombardment could continue far longer than many German commanders expected. Barrages that might have lasted minutes in earlier wars could continue for hours, and sometimes even longer. By late 1944, as Allied forces advanced deeper into Western Europe, this artillery system had matured into one of the most effective battlefield networks of the entire war. The stage was now set for the moment when that system would face one of the German army's last great offensives, a battle fought deep in the forests and frozen roads of Belgium, where artillery fire would soon reshape the course of the campaign. The relentless artillery fire that stunned German soldiers on the Western Front did not begin at the guns themselves. It began thousands of miles away in factories, rail yards, and shipyards across the United States. In December 1940, nearly a year before America officially entered the war, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed the American public during a radio broadcast. In that speech, he described the role the United States would play in the global conflict. The nation, he said, would become the arsenal of democracy. At the time, much of Europe had already fallen under German control. Britain stood alone against the Axis powers. American industry, still recovering from the Great Depression, suddenly faced a new and enormous task, producing the weapons needed to defeat some of the most powerful armies in the world. Factories that had once built automobiles began manufacturing tanks and trucks. Steel mills expanded their production to feed a growing demand for guns and artillery barrels. Chemical plants produced explosives for bombs and shells. Railroads transported raw materials and finished weapons across vast distances. The scale of production quickly became unprecedented. By the middle of the war, American factories were producing tens of thousands of artillery pieces and hundreds of millions of shells. Entire industrial complexes focused solely on ammunition production. Workers labored around the clock in rotating shifts, ensuring that the supply of artillery shells never slowed. Each shell required careful assembly. Steel casings were forged and shaped. Explosive fillings were inserted and sealed. Fuses were attached to determine how the shell would detonate, whether on impact, above ground, or after penetrating obstacles. Every component had to function perfectly, because a malfunction could endanger the artillery crews who fired them. Once completed, these shells began an enormous journey toward the battlefields of Europe. Train convoys carried them from inland factories to major Atlantic ports. From there, cargo ships loaded with ammunition crossed the ocean in heavily guarded convoys. German submarines attempted to disrupt these shipments throughout the war, but the Allied convoy system gradually reduced those threats. By 1944, millions of artillery shells had already reached supply depots in Britain. But supplying artillery in battle required far more than stockpiles. Once Allied forces landed during the Normandy landings in June 1944, the front line began moving rapidly across France and Belgium. As armies advanced, ammunition depots had to move with them. A complex transportation network developed behind the front. Railways were repaired by military engineers. Temporary bridges were constructed over destroyed river crossings. Convoys of supply trucks drove day and night, carrying ammunition forward to artillery units positioned just behind the fighting. One of the most important supply systems during this period became the Red Ball Express, a massive trucking operation that transported fuel, food, and ammunition from coastal ports to advancing Allied armies. Thousands of trucks moved along designated routes, sometimes covering hundreds of miles each day. Among their cargo were the heavy crates containing artillery shells. A single artillery battalion could consume enormous quantities of ammunition in a short period of time. During major operations, batteries might fire thousands of shells within hours, without constant resupply. Even the most powerful artillery unit would quickly fall silent. But American logistics planners had prepared for exactly this challenge. Supply depots were carefully organized so that trucks arriving at artillery positions could quickly unload ammunition and return for another shipment. Replacement shells often arrived before the previous stockpile had been fully exhausted. For artillery crews at the front, this meant one crucial advantage: they could keep firing. German commanders often underestimated this logistical capability. In earlier wars, artillery barges were typically limited by ammunition shortages. Guns would fire intensely for short periods before pausing to conserve shells. But the American system was different. As long as supply routes remained open, artillery batteries could continue firing for extended periods, sometimes throughout entire battles. The result was a sustained level of firepower that few armies had previously experienced. By late 1944, this enormous supply network stretched from American factories to the forests and villages of Western Europe. Millions of shells waited in depots, ready to be delivered wherever the front line demanded. All that remained was the moment when those shells would be needed most. That moment arrived when German forces launched a sudden and powerful offensive through the Ardennes, an attack that would soon collide with one of the most powerful artillery systems ever assembled. By late 1944, American artillery had become far more than a collection of guns placed behind the front lines. It was an organized system, carefully designed so that information, firepower, and ammunition could move with remarkable speed. At the heart of that system stood the forward observer. These men operated at the very edge of the battlefield. Moving alongside infantry platoons, they carried field radios, binoculars, and detailed topographic maps. Their task was simple in principle but dangerous in practice: locate enemy positions and direct artillery fire onto them. When a forward observer spotted a German machine gun nest, troop movement, or armor vehicle, he transmitted coordinates back to the artillery command center. Within seconds, calculations were made. Angles, distances, elevation, and wind conditions were adjusted. Then the order was given. Moments later, artillery shells began to arrive. The guns responsible for most of this firepower were weapons like the M2 A1 105mm howitzer. Compact, reliable, and powerful, this artillery piece became the backbone of American field artillery during the war. It could fire shells more than 7 miles and maintain a rapid rate of fire when crews worked efficiently. For heavier targets, fortifications, defensive strong points, or concentrations of armored vehicles, the U.S. Army relied on larger weapons such as the M1 155mm howitzer. These guns fired massive shells capable of demolishing bunkers and tearing apart enemy formations. Yet the real power of American artillery came not from individual guns, but from coordination. American doctrine allowed artillery units to combine their fire across large areas of the battlefield. If an infantry unit encountered heavy resistance, multiple artillery battalions could be assigned to the same target. Dozens of guns could fire simultaneously, saturating enemy positions with explosives. One of the most effective techniques developed during the war became known as time on target. Instead of firing shells one battery at a time, artillery units calculated firing sequences so that shells from many different guns would land at the same moment. Some guns fired earlier with higher trajectories. Others fired later with flatter arcs. Despite the different paths, the shells arrived together. For the soldiers on the receiving end, the effect was devastating. Rather than hearing incoming shells one by one and taking cover, enemy troops suddenly experienced an entire barrage striking at once. Explosions erupted across their positions before they had time to react. Technology also played an important role. During the later years of the war, American artillery began using improved proximity fuses. These devices allowed shells to detonate in the air just above the ground, scattering fragments across a wide area. Instead of exploding on impact, the shell burst overhead, sending deadly shrapnel downward into trenches, foxholes, and exposed infantry. This made artillery even more lethal against troops in the open. But even the most advanced artillery system depended on something less dramatic, yet equally essential: logistics. Behind every gun position, supply trucks moved continuously along muddy roads and narrow forest tracks. Their cargo consisted of wooden crates filled with shells, propellant charges, and replacement equipment. Drivers navigated through darkness, rain, and occasional enemy fire to deliver ammunition where it was needed. Each artillery battery maintained carefully organized ammunition dumps nearby. Crews stacked shells in orderly rows, ready to be loaded as soon as firing orders arrived. When one supply truck finished unloading, another often appeared soon afterward. This constant flow of ammunition allowed American artillery to maintain sustained barrages far longer than many armies expected. For the soldiers operating the guns, the process became almost mechanical. Load, aim, fire. Recoil shook the gun backward. Smoke drifted from the barrel. Spent casings were cleared away while another shell was lifted into position. Again and again the cycle repeated, hour after hour. And when major battles erupted, such as a sudden German offensive in the Ardennes, this carefully organized system would unleash a level of firepower that many German soldiers had never encountered before. But to understand the true impact of that firepower, it is necessary to look at the experience from the other side of the battlefield, where the shells were landing. For German soldiers on the Western Front in late 1944, artillery was not unfamiliar. The Wehrmacht had relied on powerful artillery support since the early campaigns of the war. German gunners were well trained, and their artillery pieces were capable of delivering accurate and destructive fire. Yet by the final years of the conflict, the balance of artillery power had begun to change. German industry was under enormous pressure. Allied bombing campaigns had damaged factories and transportation networks. Raw materials were increasingly scarce, and fuel shortages complicated the movement of heavy equipment. Although German artillery units continued to fight with determination, their ammunition supplies were often limited. Commanders had to think carefully about when to fire. A prolonged barrage could quickly exhaust the shells available to a battery. In many cases, artillery officers were instructed to conserve ammunition for critical moments, defensive emergencies, or major attacks. As a result, German artillery fire was frequently precise but brief. American artillery behaved differently. When U.S. guns opened fire, the bombardment sometimes continued far longer than German soldiers expected. Barrages that began as short bursts could evolve into sustained waves of explosions. Shells struck trenches, forests, and roadways with relentless rhythm. For soldiers caught in the open, the experience was overwhelming. The first explosions often shattered the quiet of the battlefield with little warning. Moments later, more shells followed. Tree trunks splintered under the force of the blasts. Earth and debris rained down into foxholes. The sound of incoming shells became a continuous roar that echoed across valleys and forests. Many German soldiers described these moments in letters and battlefield reports as Trommelfeuer or drumfire, an unbroken pounding that seemed to shake the ground itself. The psychological pressure was enormous. Unlike small arms fire, artillery struck from beyond visible range. The gunners were miles away, hidden behind hills or forests. Soldiers under bombardment could not fight back directly. Their only defense was to dig deeper into the earth and wait for the barrage to end. But sometimes the barrage did not end quickly. Instead, it continued for hours. In the forests of Belgium and Luxembourg during the winter of 1944, this relentless artillery fire became a defining feature of the battle. German troops advancing through narrow roads and wooded terrain often found themselves suddenly caught under heavy bombardment directed by American forward observers. Even armored units were vulnerable. Tank crews advancing through the Ardennes frequently encounter artillery fire that forced them to halt or disperse. Shells exploding nearby could damage tracks, disable vehicles, or scatter supporting infantry. Progress slowed as formations attempted to regroup under the constant threat of incoming fire. Meanwhile, American commanders viewed artillery as one of their greatest strategic advantages. Generals such as Dwight D. Eisenhower and George S. Patton recognized the importance of maintaining artillery superiority across the front. Their forces might sometimes face experienced German units, but the combination of American industry, logistics, and fire coordination allowed them to deploy artillery in extraordinary concentration. Entire battalions could be assigned to support a single threatened sector. If German forces attempted to break through a defensive line, artillery units across the region could rapidly shift their fire onto the advancing troops. Dozens of guns might suddenly begin firing on the same coordinates, transforming the battlefield into a zone of continuous explosions. For German commanders attempting to maintain the momentum of their offensive operations, this artillery response created constant difficulties. Every delay allowed American defenders to regroup. Every barrage slowed the advance. And every shell that struck the frozen ground of the Ardennes carried a message about the enormous industrial and logistical power standing behind the Allied armies. As the winter offensive unfolded, these factors would converge in one of the most dramatic confrontations of artillery fire during the entire European war, a moment when hundreds of guns would speak at once, and the fate of a major German attack would hang in the balance. Before dawn on December 16, 1944, the quiet forests of the Ardennes were suddenly shattered by one of the largest German offensives of the Second World War. Under orders from Adolf Hitler, German forces launched a massive surprise attack across a wide front stretching through eastern Belgium and Luxembourg. The operation would later become known as the Battle of the Bulge. German planners hoped the offensive would achieve several critical goals at once. Armored divisions would punch through the thinly defended Allied lines, drive rapidly westward, and seize the vital port of Antwerp. If successful, the attack could split Allied armies in two and force a negotiated peace in the West. To create maximum surprise, the assault began in darkness and winter fog. Thousands of German artillery guns opened fire at the same moment, sending shells crashing into American positions scattered across the forest. Explosions echoed through the valleys as telephone lines snapped and command posts scrambled to understand the scale of the attack. German infantry and armored columns soon followed the bombardment, advancing through narrow roads lined with dense trees. In the first hours of the offensive, several American units were caught off guard. Some defensive positions were quickly overrun as German forces pressed forward with determination. The thick forests and poor weather limited Allied air support, allowing German ground units to advance deeper into the Ardennes than many had expected. But the American response began forming almost immediately. Despite the confusion of the surprise attack, artillery units of the United States Army remained operational in many sectors. Field telephones and radios carried urgent reports from frontline observers who could see German troops moving along forest roads and gathering near villages. Within minutes, coordinates began reaching artillery command centers. Officers studied their maps under dim lights as incoming reports described enemy columns pushing through the woods. Calculations were made quickly, distance, direction, elevation. Then the firing orders were issued. Across the hills and field behind the front line, artillery crews rushed to their guns. Soldiers lifted heavy shells from wooden crates and carried them to waiting howitzers. Breeches opened and slammed shut as the first rounds were loaded. The guns fired. Weapons such as the M2A1 105mm howitzer roared into action, their barrels recoiling violently with each shot. Smoke drifted across the frozen ground as shell after shell arced high above the forest canopy. Moments later, the first explosions erupted along the German advance routes. Columns moving through narrow roads suddenly found themselves under bombardment. Shells burst among vehicles and marching infantry, sending fragments tearing through the trees. Drivers attempted to steer trucks and armored vehicles off the roads, but the confined terrain made maneuvering difficult. Another volley followed, then another. Artillery batteries continued firing in coordinated sequences, adjusting their aim as forward observers tracked the movement of German units. Some batteries fired rapidly for several minutes before pausing briefly to correct their range. Then the bombardment resumed again. The scale of the firepower soon increased. Additional artillery battalions were assigned to support the threatened sectors. Guns positioned miles apart began concentrating their fire on the same roads and assembly areas. The sound of explosions rolled continuously through the forest valleys. For German troops advancing through the Ardennes, the surprise they had hoped to achieve was now colliding with the growing force of American artillery. The deeper the offensive pushed into Allied territory, the more artillery units could bring their guns to bear. German commanders quickly realized that every delay was costly. Armored spearheads needed to move rapidly before Allied reinforcements could arrive. Yet constant shelling slowed movement, damaged vehicles, and scattered infantry units that were supposed to support the advancing tanks. Road junctions became particularly dangerous. Whenever German columns attempted to pass through villages or narrow crossroads, artillery observers often spotted them. Within minutes, shells began falling around the choke points, forcing vehicles to halt or disperse. Progress slowed. The forest that had once concealed the German advance now trapped formations under a storm of artillery fire. But the most intense barrage of the battle had not yet begun. In the days ahead, American commanders would concentrate hundreds of artillery guns into coordinated strikes, barges so powerful that entire German attacks would collapse beneath them. As the German offensive pushed deeper into the Ardennes during the early days of the Battle of the Bulge, the battlefield slowly transformed into a test of endurance. German armored divisions attempted to maintain their momentum along the narrow roads cutting through the dense forests of Belgium and Luxembourg. Columns of tanks, half-tracks, supply trucks, and infantry stretched for miles along winding routes. Snow and ice covered the ground, making movement even more difficult. Speed was essential. The success of the German plan depended on rapid breakthroughs. If the armored spearheads could reach open terrain and capture key river crossings, the road toward Antwerp might open. But every hour delay allowed Allied forces to regroup, and behind those Allied lines, artillery was gathering. American commanders began concentrating their artillery units in threatened sectors of the front. Individual battalions that had previously supported separate divisions were now coordinated into larger fire groups. Communication lines buzzed with constant activity as forward observers reported German troop movements. Soon, dozens of artillery batteries were ready to fire together. When the orders came, the effect was immediate. Guns positioned across miles of countryside opened fire almost simultaneously. Shells from weapons such as the M2 A1 105mm howitzer and the heavier M1 155mm howitzer arced into the winter sky. Their targets were German roads, forest clearings, and villages where advancing units were attempting to regroup. Forward observers carefully tracked these movements. From church towers, hillsides, and hidden observation posts, they watched through binoculars as German columns moved through the terrain below. Every sighting was quickly transmitted by radio. Coordinates, distances, adjustments. Then the guns fired again. One of the most devastating techniques used during these moments was the time-on-target barrage. Instead of shells arriving in scattered sequences, artillery officers calculated firing schedules so that dozens of rounds from multiple batteries landed within seconds of each other. For soldiers on the ground, the experience was sudden and overwhelming. Explosions erupted almost simultaneously across wide areas. Forest clearings turned into clouds of smoke and shattered wood. Vehicles caught in the open were struck by fragments or forced to halt as blasts tore through nearby trees. German infantry attempting to advance alongside armored units found themselves pinned down by the continuous bombardment. Whenever troops attempted to regroup or continue forward, artillery observers detected the movement and called in another barrage. Some German commanders attempted to push their units through the shelling zones as quickly as possible. Others ordered temporary withdrawals to escape the worst bombardments. But every delay slowed the offensive. Road congestion soon became one of the most serious problems. The Ardennes region was crossed by relatively few major roads. As German vehicles attempted to maneuver around damaged equipment or destroy bridges, traffic jams developed along narrow routes. These choke points became prime targets for American artillery. When observers spotted long lines of vehicles halted on a forest road, the response was swift. Shells rained down along the entire column. Explosions struck trucks carrying fuel and ammunition. Vehicles were damaged or forced into roadside ditches. Infantry scattered into surrounding woods, seeking cover. The once carefully organized advance became increasingly fragmented. Meanwhile, American artillery units continued receiving steady resupply of ammunition from supply convoys operating behind the front. Truck after truck arrived with fresh crates of shells. For artillery crews, the process rarely stopped. Load the shell, close the breech. Fire. Recoil slammed the gun backward as smoke filled the air around the battery. Another shell was lifted from the growing stack of ammunition and placed into position. Again and again, some artillery battalions fired thousands of shells during the course of a single day. The constant flow of ammunition allowed batteries to maintain a rate of fire that astonished many German soldiers encountering it for the first time. From their positions in the forests and villages of the Ardennes, German troops began to recognize a troubling pattern. The American artillery did not fall silent. Each time the barrage seemed to weaken, another wave of shells followed. Attempts to regroup or continue the advance triggered new bombardments. The guns kept firing. For German commanders hoping to break through the Allied lines before reinforcements arrived, this relentless artillery fire became a major obstacle. Armored units that depended on speed were forced to halt repeatedly. Infantry formations struggled to maintain cohesion under the constant explosions. Gradually, the momentum of the offensive began to slow, and as the artillery fire continued to hammer the advancing forces, the balance of the battle started to shift. By the final days of December 1944, the momentum of the German offensive in the Ardennes had begun to fade. What had started as a bold and carefully planned surprise attack was now encountering a growing wall of resistance. American infantry units regrouped across the region. Engineers repaired damaged roads and bridges, and reinforcements steadily arrived to strengthen the defensive line. But one element of the Allied response had been present almost from the beginning: artillery. Throughout the fighting in the Battle of the Bulge, American artillery units played a decisive role in slowing and eventually halting the German advance. The ability to deliver continuous and coordinated barrages disrupted enemy movements at critical moments. German armored columns that depended on speed often found themselves delayed by shellfire striking narrow roads and crossroads. Vehicles damaged by explosions blocked route behind them, creating congestion that spread through entire formations. Infantry units attempting to move alongside the tanks were forced to take cover whenever artillery observers detected their positions. The terrain of the Ardennes made these problems even more severe. Dense forests limited visibility and confined troop movements to a small number of roads. Once artillery fire began striking those routes, maneuvering around the bombardment became extremely difficult. Even short delays could disrupt the tightly timed advance required for the German plan to succeed. For American commanders, this provided an opportunity. As reinforcement arrived, artillery units were reorganized into powerful fire groups capable of supporting multiple divisions at once. When German forces attempted to concentrate their troops for an attack, American forward observers quickly relayed coordinates back to the artillery batteries. Within minutes, shells began falling. The volume of fire in some sectors became extraordinary. A single artillery battalion, equipped with the M2A1 105mm howitzer, could fire hundreds of rounds in a short period of time. When several battalions coordinated their fire, thousands of shells could strike the same battlefield sector during a major engagement. Heavier weapons, such as the M1 155mm howitzer, added even greater destructive power. Their larger shells were capable of demolishing fortified positions and scattering enemy troops across wide areas. The psychological impact of this bombardment was significant. German soldiers advancing to the forest frequently encountered sudden barrages that forced them to halt and seek cover. Letters written by troops during the campaign described the experience of constant shelling, where explosions seemed to roll across the landscape without pause. Tree branches shattered under blasts. Snow and soil were thrown high into the air. The ground itself trembled beneath repeated detonations. In many places, artillery fire transformed quiet forest roads into fields of shattered vehicles and broken equipment. Trucks burned along the roadside. Abandoned artillery pieces lay overturned in the snow. Supply convoys attempting to reach the advancing front often became trapped behind damaged vehicles. As these delays increased, the carefully planned German timetable began to collapse. Armored spearheads that had initially pushed forward with speed now struggled to maintain their momentum. Fuel shortages, mechanical breakdowns, and growing Allied resistance slowed the advance further. Meanwhile, American forces continued to strengthen their positions and coordinate counterattacks. Artillery remained central to these defensive efforts. Because American guns were supported by a reliable supply network, ammunition rarely ran out during critical moments of the battle. Truck convoys delivered fresh shells to artillery batteries, even as the fighting intensified. Crews continued firing as long as forward observers identified targets. This ability to maintain sustained firepower gave the Allied defenders a powerful advantage. German commanders had hoped to break through quickly before the Allies could respond in force. Instead, their advancing units found themselves repeatedly halted by artillery barrages that seemed to continue without interruption. Gradually, the offensive began to lose its strength. The forests of the Ardennes, once intended to conceal the German advance, had become a landscape dominated by the thunder of artillery guns. And as the days passed, the consequences of that relentless firepower would become increasingly clear. By the end of December 1944, the initial surprise of the German offensive in the Ardennes had worn off. What had begun as a rapid thrust aimed at splitting Allied lines now faltered under sustained artillery fire and coordinated resistance. German forces, exhausted and disorganized, faced an increasingly determined counterattack. American artillery remained at the heart of the Allied response. Coordinated fire groups maintained continuous barrages on German supply routes, crossroads, and assembly areas. Shells landed with terrifying precision, targeting not just advancing infantry, but also armored vehicles, fuel trucks, and communications equipment. Each explosion delayed the enemy, reduced their cohesion, and sapped their momentum. The scale of American artillery fire was staggering. During the heaviest days of the battle, hundreds of artillery pieces, 105mm howitzers, 155mm heavy guns, and self-propelled cannons fired thousands of shells in coordinated sequences. Ammunition flowed constantly from supply depots via trucks and repaired railways. No German assault could exhaust these resources. For soldiers on the ground, the sensation was an unending storm of steel raining from unseen guns. German commanders attempted to adapt. Officers shifted tanks to flank positions, tried night movements, and ordered infantry to bypass the most heavily shelled areas. But the combination of relentless artillery, logistical superiority, and quick Allied counterattacks rendered these maneuvers largely ineffective. Columns stalled in snow-covered roads, armored units became bogged down, and infantry lost cohesion under repeated barrages. By early January 1945, the tide had fully turned. Allied forces, reinforced and resupplied, launched counteroffensives that steadily pushed the Germans back. Villages and forested areas recaptured by American units bore the scars of intense bombardment. Trees splintered, roads cratered, and fields torn by shell fire. Battlefield reports noted thousands of destroyed vehicles, hundreds of abandoned weapons, and a disarray of German formations. The human cost was high, but the strategic lesson was clear. American artillery, backed by unmatched industrial capacity and logistical planning, could sustain operations in a way that German forces could not match. Commanders on both sides recognized that the war's outcome increasingly depended on the ability to supply and coordinate firepower over extended fronts. German forces retreated from the Ardennes. Their offensive ambitions halted. By mid-January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge had ended with a decisive Allied victory. The German army suffered approximately 100,000 casualties, with tens of thousands captured or missing. Equipment losses were significant, particularly tanks and trucks immobilized by shellfire and snow. In contrast, American forces endured around 80,000 casualties, but retained cohesion and operational momentum. Beyond numbers, the psychological effect of American artillery was profound. German soldiers who survived the campaign often described the experience in diaries and letters, noting the shock of facing artillery that seemed endless. The perception that U.S. guns never ran dry became a defining memory of the Ardennes campaign. This realization underscored a broader truth. Industrial and logistical power could translate directly into battlefield dominance. The collapse of the German offensive marked a turning point. From this moment, the Allies maintained initiative in Western Europe. Combined with air superiority and coordinated infantry armor tactics, sustained artillery barrages allowed American forces to press toward the Rhine, eventually crossing into Germany itself. Every major defensive effort encountered the same reality. American artillery, relentless and precise, supported by supply lines capable of keeping it firing indefinitely. The Ardennes campaign demonstrated the full integration of technology, logistics, and doctrine. It revealed how an army's industrial might could be projected across hundreds of miles to shape the battlefield. For German forces, the battle was a stark example of how even well-trained and determined troops could be undone when facing a system capable of sustained, overwhelming firepower. As the snow melted and the forest quieted, the landscape bore witness to the extraordinary scale of the engagement. Craters shattered vehicles and spent shells-lined roads and fields. Yet amid the devastation, the lessons of coordination, logistics, and artillery supremacy became evident, not only to commanders but to the soldiers who had survived the storm of steel. The guns of the Ardennes fell silent, but the echoes of their fire lingered in the minds of those who survived. The winter forest bore the marks of conflict: splintered trees, cratered roads, and the shattered remnants of vehicles and artillery. Yet beyond the physical destruction lay a deeper lesson about the nature of modern warfare. The relentless barrage of American artillery was not the result of magic or chance. It was the product of meticulous planning, technological innovation, and an industrial machine operating at an unprecedented scale. From factories across the United States to the supply convoys threading through Europe, every shell represented a chain of human effort, calculation, and endurance. The ability to sustain such firepower revealed a fundamental truth of the Second World War. Victory depended as much on logistics and production as on bravery or tactics. For the soldiers facing these barrages, the experience was both terrifying and humbling. German troops learned firsthand the consequences of confronting an opponent whose firepower could not easily be exhausted. American artillery crews, by contrast, bore the weight of responsibility with precision and discipline, aware that each shell fired shaped the outcome of the battle and saved lives on the front lines. The Battle of the Bulge demonstrated how industrial capacity could transform a battlefield into a landscape dominated not just by men, but by the careful orchestration of weapons, technology, and supply. It illustrated that the human and mechanical elements of war were inseparable, each reinforcing the other to create decisive results. In the end, the Ardennes campaign was more than a battle of tanks and infantry. It was a testament to preparation, coordination, and the quiet endurance required to sustain overwhelming force. The shock experienced by German soldiers, watching shells rain endlessly without pause, was a reminder that warfare in the modern age was no longer measured solely by courage, but by the capacity to combine human skill with industrial might. And as the snow receded and Europe moved toward the final months of conflict, one fact remained undeniable. The lessons learned in the forests of the Ardennes would shape military thinking for generations. Artillery had proven its power not just as a weapon of destruction, but as a force that could dictate the pace, direction, and outcome of battle. The guns had fallen silent, but history would never forget the storm they had unleashed.